Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the 9th biennial Winter Wildlands Alliance Grassroots Advocacy Conference. Biennial, as I said in our last panel, is one of those obscure Greek words, Latin words that means every 2 years. It's kind of a shame not to be piled into a lodge on Donner Summit together where we can mingle in between sessions and see old friends and meet new friends. But hopefully this format allows people to join from all over the country with minimal resources, and that's the good side of doing the virtual thing. If you could please, while people are joining, jump into the chat and introduce yourselves. Just give us your name, where you're calling in from, and your favorite mode of travel in winter. That would be great. So while that's going on, I apologize to those of you who were at the first panel. I'm going to repeat a little bit of this, but I'll go through a little intro spiel. I'm David Page. I'm the Advocacy Director for Winter Wildlands Alliance. I'm based in Mammoth Lakes, California, which is Payahunadu, traditional and current homelands of the Paiute and Shoshone peoples, and our main office is in Boise, Idaho, which is on Shoshone and Bannock territory. Hilary, my colleague, our policy director, is based in Bozeman. We are an alliance of 32 different grassroots groups all across the country. This is sort of a new tagline that we're still working on, but we work to educate, inspire, and empower people to take care of their public lands and wild winter landscapes. We have a snow school program that runs across the country on 70 different sites and gets about 34,000 people out, 34,000 mostly underserved students out on the landscape in the wintertime. We also have a Backcountry Film Festival, which hopefully many of you have had a chance to attend, and it's in a normal year we would have about 100 screenings across the country. Last year we did a bunch of virtual screenings, and we will probably be doing kind of a hybrid version this year. If there's a chance to see it outdoors locally, certainly want to join that. We also work on quite a bit of public lands policy and advocacy, and that's what we'll be talking about today. We rely really heavily on our members and try to serve our membership. So if you're not a member, please do join. You can check our website, winterwildlands.org/join, I think is what the latest link is. Housekeeping. So the theme of the conference today is, can we save the backcountry from ourselves? We've already had one panel this morning on messaging on public lands and partnerships with the land management agencies, which was great. All the panels will be available afterwards on the website. This is being recorded. This morning's was being recorded. So please do, if you can't make one of the panels, check in afterwards and be sure to share with your colleagues. Let's see, we'll be talking also about, we've got a panel on funding that's going to be really excellent. How do we fund our land management agencies? What are the different complex channels for getting money into land management? Talking about winter travel planning right now. We'll be talking about snow ranger and trail host programs this afternoon. Tomorrow we'll be talking about ski area expansions, and also we'll have a panel with athlete influencers talking about social media and how we get sort of ethics of inclusion and responsible land use across on social media. So just quickly, since we're talking about public lands, and again, I apologize for repeating, but I think it bears repeating. I think, as we all know, we have a responsibility to acknowledge that our public lands are a product of a long and often tragic and violent history. People have been living on these landscapes and depending on these ecosystems for thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years. And a lot of people were removed from these landscapes violently and at gunpoint or killed outright. And not to dwell on the past, but I think that underscores the responsibility that we all have in a contemporary setting, in a democracy, to participate in the ongoing stewardship of these lands and making sure that that all people have access to them, and that future generations inherit what we've inherited, or ideally it would even be better and healthier than when we inherited them, and that's going to be an uphill struggle. So without further ado, we're going to have we've got some great panelists joining us to talk about winter travel planning. We may or may not have the forest supervisor on the Plumas National Forest joining us, probably from a fire camp. We talked to him for about 10 minutes yesterday from in the field where, as many of you probably know, the Dixie fire is still raging. There's another fire raging just north of me, and as much as I'm appreciating the clear sky that I have today for the first time in weeks, I worry that that does not bode so well for the folks in South Lake Tahoe who are on the front edge of the Caldor fire. So without further ado, let me kick it over to my policy colleague, Hilary Eisen, to introduce yourself, and then we'll go from there.
Well, thank you, David. So my name is Hilary Eisen, and I'm the Policy Director for Winter Wildlands Alliance. And I'm based in Bozeman, Montana, in the traditional lands of the Blackfeet people, as well as the Bannock, Crow, Flathead, Nez Perce, Shoshone, and many others. And yeah, excited to talk about winter travel planning today. It's been the main focus of my work for going on 8 years now. So on to you, Jody.
Yeah, Jody.
Great. I'm Jody Holzworth. I'm a Deputy Regional Forester for the U.S. Forest Service here in California, and fairly new to the job. I've been on about 5 months, but learned a great deal from the folks here on the panel and with my Forest Service colleagues. So really looking forward to the conversation today.
Thanks, Jody. And again, we've got Darrel Jury trying to connect. I assume that we'll have him in the next few minutes, but he's calling in also from the Plumas National Forest, or right adjacent, where he's about a mile from the fire line on the Dixie fire. So, and I've been to his little cabin, and he doesn't have great Wi-Fi, so he may end up calling in, but it'll be good to hear his perspective. So again, we do this every couple of years. We talk about winter travel planning. As an organization, we've been involved in winter travel planning, OSV planning, and forest planning for decades. OSV planning in particular in California for about the last 7 years. Hilary is really our policy lead on that, and probably the nationwide expert in winter travel planning. So Hilary, I'm just going to pass it right off to you to talk about sort of how we got here and where, first of all, where we are, and then how we got here, and then we'll move on from there.
Yeah, and before I get started, David, it looks like Darrel has joined us on the phone, and so do we want to give him a second to introduce himself real quick?
Sure, Darrel, can you hear us? Can you speak?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Give us a quick introduction, and then we'll get moving.
Yes, Darrel Jury, President, Friends of Plumas Wilderness. As you said, David, I'm in Plumas County at the ancestral and current homelands of the Mountain Maidu, and we're at the headwaters of the State Water Project. And currently, the Plumas and Lassen National Forest are burning with the Dixie Fire, the largest single fire in California recorded history.
Well, we know you got a lot going on there. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us to talk about something that I think we're all waiting for the snow to happen sooner rather than later.
Definitely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, back to you, Hilary.
Cool, yeah. So I'm going to get started with just a quick recap of the Oversnow Vehicle Rule to give some background on how exactly we got to where we're at. I know a lot of folks listening in today are very familiar with winter travel planning. I looked at the list of participants and recognized a lot of names and have worked with a lot of you on winter travel planning in different parts of the country. But for those of you who are maybe new to this, just to get everybody grounded on some of this, the sort of basic history here, winter travel planning is something that's happened on national forest land for a long time, but the sort of current era of winter travel planning dates back to 2015 when the Forest Service finalized an Oversnow Vehicle Rule. This was an amendment to the 2005 Travel Management Rule, and it mandated over snow vehicle travel planning. So prior to 2015, that sort of travel management planning was optional for national forests. It is now required for any national forest that receives sufficient snow to support winter recreation, or for any portion of a national forest that receives that sufficient amount of snow. And what counts as sufficient, is maybe up for debate. There's not a hard and fast rule around that. But under the over snow vehicle rule, national forests have to go through a process to designate a system of areas and routes for over snow vehicle travel. And once they've completed that designation process, the designated system is depicted on an over snow vehicle use map. And once that over snow vehicle use map is published, over snow vehicle use outside of the designated system is prohibited. And so right now, where very few forests have completed winter travel planning, sort of the status quo across the national forest system is that you can take over snow vehicles, so snowmobiles, timber sleds, what have you. You can kind of take them anywhere that they're not expressly prohibited. But the over snow vehicle rule brought a real systemic change to how the Forest Service manages over snow vehicles. And once we get through travel planning, the standard will be that that sort of use is allowed in designated areas, and forests are closed except for where use is allowed. So it's kind of flipped that whole framework on its head. It's really a new paradigm of winter travel management, and something that we think brings a really great opportunity for all stakeholders coming together and assessing where motorized use is appropriate in the wintertime and how to best manage that use. And it also gives an opportunity to think about what other uses are happening in the winter, whether it's backcountry skiing, snowshoeing, wildlife habitat, wildlife use of a landscape, other uses and management priorities that the Forest Service may have for a particular area. And when a forest goes through travel management planning, what they're essentially doing is implementing some executive orders from the 1970s. So this goes back a really long time. And those executive orders laid out what are known as the minimization criteria, which is a specific criteria for designation of trails and areas for motorized use that the responsible official, whether it's the forest supervisor or the district ranger, sort of depending on the sort of level of the plan, but what they need to be considering and then minimizing impacts to. And so those minimization criteria, which are really at the heart of travel management planning, are to minimize impacts or minimize damage to soils, watersheds, vegetation, and other forest resources, to minimize harassment of wildlife and significant disruption of wildlife habitat, to minimize conflict between motor vehicle use and existing or proposed recreational uses on National Forest System lands or neighboring federal lands, and to minimize conflicts among different classes of motor vehicle uses on Forest Service lands or neighboring federal lands. And then they also need to take into account the compatibility of motor vehicle use with existing conditions in populated areas. So that's, sound and emissions and other factors that might affect a populated area, if you have a neighborhood adjacent to national forest land or what have you. And so when we are going through travel management planning on a national forest or a portion of a national forest, a lot of the analysis and a lot of the discussion is around how to comply with that minimization criteria. And we've learned a lot about kind of how to do that. It's a little bit more complicated, I think. It's proven to be more complicated than maybe at first glance it seems like it would be. And so the OSV rule was finalized in 2015. And pretty much right away, actually, I think before the ink was really dry on the rule itself, we had some national forests in California in the sort of central and northern Sierra begin to implement the OSV rule. And so the Lassen, the Stanislaus, the El Dorado, the Tahoe, and the Plumas all started winter travel planning shortly after the OSV rule was finalized. All of these forests are in California, which is in Region 5 of the Forest Service system. And they all sort of have been working together with coordination from the regional office, Jody's office, to kind of learn from each other and have some consistency across the forest. They're all adjacent to each other. outside of California, OSB planning is also happening on the Shoshone National Forest in Northwest Wyoming at a forest-wide scale. And we've also seen forests that were going through OSB planning, but kind of pre-OSB rule where there weren't really specific, like they had regulations to follow, but they changed a little when the OSB rule was published, that sort of switched gears and adopted the OSB, kind of switched over to following the OSB rule once that was published in 2015. And so the Bitterroot National Forest, for instance, published a travel management plan under the OSB rule, but it had actually started that planning process much, much earlier than 2015. And so the California forest plus the Shoshone are the first forest-wide travel plans to be sort of fully under the OSV rule. And today we're going to really focus on the California forest because they're the furthest along and I think offer the best examples of sort of how winter travel planning works and what we've learned from it. There's 5 that are kind of these early adopters that I listed earlier, and they're all nearing the end of their OSB planning processes. The Stanislaus National Forest actually published a record of decision in June. They haven't published an oversnow vehicle use map yet. That will be next, and I think pending fire activity and Forest Service capacity, hopefully they'll be able to get an OSBM, an oversnow vehicle use map out before it actually starts snowing. And we're also hopeful that some of these other forests in the Sierra will also be able to publish maps before snow season really starts. But of course, there are some really historic fires happening in California right now, and that is setting things back a bit as far as having capacity to deal with travel planning at this time. But these initial early adopters have really been guinea pigs when we started this process. And by we, I mean Winter Wildlands Alliance, the Forest Service, other conservation organizations, other backcountry skiing organizations. There's a number of snowmobile clubs and organizations that have been involved, as well as just a lot of members of the public who maybe they ski, maybe they snowmobile, maybe they do both. There's been a lot of public participation. And in 2015, when this started, I think it's fair to say that most of us didn't really know how the process was going to work. And the process didn't necessarily start out on the right foot, and this really slowed everything down. It actually necessitated a restart after over a year of work. The Lassen was the first to get started. They published a final environmental impact statement and a draft plan, and the regional office took a look at it and told them to go back to the drawing board. And the reason for that was that they had not fully grasped that open unless designated closed versus unless designated open framework. And they had sort of written an entire plan under the wrong framework. And so they had to go back and think about what areas are we designating for snowmobile use, not what areas are we closing to snowmobile use. And then all the other forests realized that they needed to also kind of rethink how they were framing things. And so everybody sort of started over in late 2016, early 2017. And the sort of miscommunication in framing the process, I think, left the public feeling confused and arguing over things that were somewhat irrelevant to the process. And getting all of that sorted out has really slowed things down. And hopefully moving forward, as we start winter travel planning on other forests, we don't repeat that and we can actually start out on the right foot from the beginning. Some of the key lessons that we learned during travel planning, or that we've been learning during travel planning here, include, what exactly is closed unless designated open? What does that mean? How do you talk about a travel plan in that way? Obviously there's snowmobile use, over snow vehicle use occurring across, any national forest that has snow. So you're not starting from a blank slate here. And so how do you shift that framework while recognizing that, there is activity occurring on the land, and framing, at the very beginning of the process, explaining to the public what it is the Forest Service is doing. I think it's something that we've learned is really important so that people come into the process understanding what they can expect from it. Along those same lines, another lesson we've learned is, the importance of setting sideboards on OSV planning. This is something, and we'll talk, I think Darrel and Chris, if he joins us, we'll talk about more, and specifically with the Plumas, where we've had some really great conversations with other stakeholders, with the Forest Service about, very specific, like how people use a particular canyon, or like what the boundary should be for a particular area. But a lot of those conversations didn't actually happen until the objection process, which is the very last step in the administrative process. And those are the kind of conversations that would be much more productive, maybe even before NEPA starts, at the very beginning of a travel planning process. Because that's really, when you're talking about snowmobile designations, you really are talking very site specific. This is a very site specific process. And, it gets into like people sitting down together and poring over maps and talking about how they use the landscape, but doing so in a way where they understand sort of the framework of the conversation and the point of the exercise. Another important lesson learned was how to apply the minimization criteria. So I mentioned those different criteria and how they're the heart of winter travel planning. But you can't just look at the forest as a whole. You're in forest planning, which is another Forest Service process we do a lot of work in. You're looking at the forest as a whole and thinking very large scale. Winter travel planning, you're getting very site specific, and you actually have to apply those minimization criteria to every trail and every area that you're considering to designate for snowmobile use. And it's hard to think about how to do that, but Region 5 leadership actually developed a really good methodology for this. Basically a spreadsheet with, some screening questions that, and it's, it kind of depends on the forest what those screening questions are going to be, that get at like, what are the natural resources, the wildlife, the different uses specific to that forest. And then, having for every trail that they were considering and every area for cross-country travel that they were considering, putting them through that screening criteria and saying, does this apply, yes or no? And if the answer is yes, well, then how are we going to minimize the impacts, that we see if there's, Sierra Nevada red fox is an endangered species on the Stanislaus National Forest. What steps are we going to take if we want to designate an area that's red fox habitat for snowmobile use? How do we minimize that impact? And minimize does not mean eliminate. It really does mean minimize, but it has to be at that very specific level of each trail in each area. And we don't necessarily agree with the conclusions that every step of that process, the spreadsheet, and whether the Forest Service felt that they minimized a particular impact or not. We again, depending on the trail and the area and the forest, like we may not always agree, but the process that Region 5 developed, I think, is one that is really solid, and one that other forests and regions should really adopt and follow. It's very, very clear, very easy to understand, and very systematic. And there's no real confusion around how the Forest Service got to a particular conclusion or not. So those, I think, are kind of some of the main lessons. There's a lot more that we could dig into, but our time is limited, and I want to, close things up here. And so I want to just wrap up with what comes next with winter travel planning. And so now that we're getting towards the end of the actual planning process, our thoughts are turning to implementation. How do we take these plans and ensure that they actually mean something on the ground, and they aren't just dust gathering paperweights in a forest supervisor's office? And so we've been spending some time researching other OSV plans that were written years before, in particular, the White River National Forest in Colorado and the Gallatin National Forest here in Montana are both forests that wrote winter travel plans under the travel management rule in the early 2000s. And so we've been looking at those plans, which have been on the books for a while now and have been implemented, to understand what's worked and what hasn't worked. And a few key things that jump out is really as soon as your travel plan is finalized, putting a lot of resources into education and working with partners on that education, and it's not just signs and maps, but really having people out on the ground talking to winter recreationists about what the new plan is and where they can recreate on, if you're out, if you run into someone with a snowmobile or somebody on skis, like where to go to have, to have that experience, to do the thing they want to do, and do it in a place where it makes sense under the travel plan. Really working with partners to increase capacity to do that, and as well as putting up signs. Sometimes it involves putting up some fences to kind of direct travel in the places it needs to go. And then you can't forget about enforcement as well, but enforcement works better if it's underlaid with education. And so really emphasizing that education first, and then once the plan's been in effect for a few years, then kind of shifting more towards enforcement, but enforcement's there through the whole process.
Hilary, can I want to step in and interrupt you, and I hope we get a chance to circle back and talk about implementation, but I want to let Chris weigh in, assuming Chris, you can hear us. I think we only have him for about 10 minutes. So Chris, can you hear us?
Oh.
There he is.
Awesome.
Unmute.
There we go.
Okay.
Hey,
So Chris,
good morning or afternoon.
If you just give us a quick introduction, who you are, and then, as a decision maker on one of these processes, if you can just talk to us about the challenges and opportunities that you came across. Oh.
Sure. So my name is Chris Carlton. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. My name is Chris Carlton. I'm the forest supervisor here on the Plumas National Forest. I've been here for about 2 years, so I came in late in the OSV process, and my background is in planning and NEPA. So a couple of things coming into this a little later in the process, and being new to the Forest Service and new to the Plumas. One of the things that really was evident was we had gone down a road, and there were we were kind of embedded in a lot of positions, and as we were looking to wrap this up, we worked with a region, and one of the things we wanted to do was just put a little bit of a pause in there and say, okay, it feels like we've got these places where we can't move toward, we can't really move forward as easily as we would like to. We've got what look like opposing views and positions. Well, if we get around the table and bring everyone there with the intent of let's see, are there some better options that we can all get to? And so we did that with a series of workshops, or we attempted to do that with a series of Zoom workshops. And what really became clear was we were very late in the process, and there were a lot of people who felt that a lot was at stake for them. And there are two really key areas where I think if we were to do this from the beginning, might do it a little bit differently. One is, and I think Hilary touched on it, the open, or the closed unless designated. When that messaging came out partway through, I think intellectually a number of the stakeholders grasped that, but from a bigger corporate perspective, as a team working on this project, I don't think that ever was truly digested and accepted, and we all recognized the place we were starting from. And so that, I think, continued to there were some misperceptions around what the sideboards were that continued as everybody moved forward. So I think that is one I would strive very hard to be very crystal clear and resolve some of those questions a little bit earlier in the process. I think the other area was the agency ended up I think the agency ended up not really, we put a series of alternatives together, but it feels like there may be opportunities for the stakeholders to work together to come up with some alternatives a little differently. And so really at the core, I strongly believe there is a way to do this in a collaborative group by picking by having some representation around a table and setting out clear sideboards and clear intent, and asking that group to come up with the alternatives rather than, I think maybe one, and I hate to use the word sides, because we need to get away from the us and them way that we look at some of these land management decisions. But there are multiple interests, and some of those interests have varying degrees of conflict around land management and allocation decisions. So how do we all come together around a table in a way that honors the value of each of those and digs a little deeper to what are the interests? And it's maybe a little bit cliche, that whole getting to yes thing, but looking at what's the interest underlying it rather than the position we're taking. And so I moving forward on another plan like this, bringing that group and identifying them up front, investing those hours, if it's 2 weeks, if it's 3 weeks, if it's a week, a month for 3 months, with everyone present to really dig into what matters, I think has the ability to give alternatives that better meet everyone's needs. The second part of that is the agency needs to do its part to be very clear around what it is and is not willing to entertain. And so things like, the Pacific Crest Trail decision space, or how are we going to handle some of our special interest areas where the groups are unable to really frame up and put something collaborative together, it puts the agency in this having to make an executive decision, which is never the best outcome for an agency to be in. None of the stakeholders want the Forest Service making decisions about stuff that matters hugely to the user groups. And so I'll kind of pause there and just summarize I think we were too late in really pushing the level of collaboration on this case. I think we have gotten to a much better place than we were. I do think there's an opportunity to do this a little bit differently and maybe learn from some of that. And I'm going to pause and not stop there. One more thing I would add is we talk about the planning as if it is the end decision. And really, it's about relationships. And the decision is the beginning. Once we get through the process, everyone's in there looking to see where we land. Once we've landed, how do we keep that same group of people as committed around the table in management, in monitoring, in adjustments, because it needs to be built on that level of relationship and not just on what's signed in the record of decision. So I'll stop there. Thanks, David.
Well, I hope in that you're committing to stay on the Plumas for the next decade, because one of the problems that we run into with stakeholders is that we establish these relationships and then you guys move on to Arkansas or somewhere else, and we have to start over again. But thanks for that, Chris.
Yeah, to train a new forest supervisor.
Yeah. I guess just maybe in 30 seconds, one thing that you've said to me that was impactful that I hadn't heard other forest supervisors speak to is the opportunity from an agency standpoint in this kind of recreation management planning. Rather than it just being something that's an onerous process that's dumped on your lap that you'd rather be doing something else. Are there aspects of this that you think are actually good for stakeholders and the environment moving forward?
Absolutely, and I will admit I come from a planning background, so I like this stuff. But this is an opportunity for us to look at as changing conditions and changing demands show up out there. All of our public lands are seeing increased visitation for a number of reasons. That puts us in positions of having to make decisions around how we manage the potential for conflict. And I just see such a great opportunity there for user groups working together with the agency to build better solutions than just an agency going out there and doing it, if we're all willing to commit the time to that.
Great, thanks for that. So on that note, local stakeholder, Darrel Jury, how has the process on both the Lassen and the Plumas been for you as a local organization with your own mission? What opportunities have you found in it, and what challenges and lessons learned?
Yeah, thanks, David. I didn't get a chance with my introduction to say that I'd been working on OSV planning on the Plumas and Lassen National Forest for over 6 years. So from the very get-go. And I grew up in the area, and these places I've played in, I love. I learned how to ski at Lassen Volcanic National Park, and these places are near and dear to my heart. I love our public lands. And this process has been challenging, and there is a bit of a silver lining. Some of the opportunities that came with this are strengthening relationships with like-minded people who love to get out and explore our public lands, and all seasons of the year. I've developed friendships with people who love these places like I do, both locally and within my region, and have created alliances that will definitely help us with future planning efforts like forest planning, whenever that might come down the road. As far as challenges, I think the biggest is that the Forest Service doesn't understand human-powered winter recreation. And a few examples really illustrate this for me. One is that the Plumas National Forest map, it has information about skiing on the Stanislaus National Forest, where they cut and pasted that information, and they didn't make it specific to our location. So it's spreading misinformation about how to recreate in this place in winter. With the Lhasa National Forest, on both their draft and final environmental impact statement, they had a photo from Washington, forest in Washington state. So the agency doesn't really know much about winter recreation and how to plan or manage it, in my mind. They think that skiers don't travel more than 5 miles from a trailhead. This came up at the workshops that Chris pointed out over and over again. And I think this is a misperception that it's getting perpetuated. People do get out and go for multiple days, and more people are doing this as they get away from ski areas, and the technology of the equipment is advancing. And finally, Chris alluded to this. So I think that the Forest Service is beginning to understand that use can change overnight. And here on the Plumas and Lhasa National Forest, we have traditionally more motorized recreation during the winter than human powered, but things are changing rapidly with the post-COVID bump up in users on our public lands. And I mentioned the advances in technology, allowing people with AT gear to get out more and more. Other challenges, David, you alluded to agency turnover. It's benefited and hurt us with planning over the last 6 years. We've gotten some good people that have come in and understood our perspective, but it's also come in and people come into the agency and have different perceptions. Some of the people, they've retired, but that started Sierra Access Coalition, motorized advocacy group, Access for Motorized Use. They worked on the Plumas National Forest, and they helped establish a lot of the motorized recreation access points that we have here. And as far as specifics related to planning, and I think this is across the board, and this was acknowledged, Chris phrased it as misperceptions around sideboards, is that the Forest Service really started out on the wrong foot regarding the closed and less marked opened. As I see it, that over snow vehicle use should be managed much like a ski area, where there are boundaries and you don't go out of bounds. And if you do, there are implications. And instead, what the focus has been on is where snowmobiles cannot travel or where OSVs cannot go. And kind of, we're looking at it with the wrong perception. And I think that we made some momentum over the years in getting the Forest Service to understand that, and other folks. But I think, and I hope that the precedent that is set here in Northern California, that doesn't move forward. I hope that forests throughout the United States will begin to get a better deal of what the sideboards are and how to get going on the right foot. And I have concerns about ending on the right foot. The Plumas National Forest has basically said that minimizing conflict between uses will not have the equal weight as other minimization criteria. And this really concerns me because it's pretty explicitly pointed out in the draft environmental impact statement that indeed it's important to look at other uses besides just over snow vehicles in this planning process, because we're all out there on the land enjoying these places in winter, and there are impacts between different user groups, even within the motorized community itself. Up at Buck Summit, where I recreate a lot, it's right out my back door. You're seeing more and more of the tracked vehicles, where you take a Jeep and you put the tracks on them, and they head up the trail when there's not much snow, and they impact the snowmobilers. So, indeed, there are impacts between user groups and different types of uses. Advice and lessons: pace yourself, build alliances within and outside of the Forest Service, become a Winter Wildlands grassroots group. It's been really beneficial learning about the intricacy of this policy. Hilary is a wealth of knowledge, and David is a great advocate. So I really appreciate what Winter Wildlands has brought to this conversation in our region.
Thanks for that, Darrell. Thanks for all of that.
Yeah.
So, Jody, I want to kick it over to you now. Sort of pull back and broad regional perspective. You've come in also late in the process, so maybe have a kind of a fresh vantage on what works and what doesn't, and what the challenges are. But also from a regional perspective, looking at 5 plans across a really broad landscape. Maybe you can speak to the challenges from the regional office, from a reviewing officer point of view. What have you been able to do or had trouble doing in terms of establishing consistency? What's your perspective on this process?
Great. Well, thank you, David. And, I really want to thank the partnership with Winter Wildlands Alliance. We appreciate the conversation and the opportunity to be here. And I'm so glad Chris could join us in the middle of months of being at fire camp. Chris is my personal hero these days. I really appreciate, Darrell, your expertise, David and Hilary, and we need to continue these conversations, and we still have much to learn from you. So thank you for that. And also, I hear you on the changing staff and having to start over with new staff. And I wish I had a good solution for that. I do plan to be around for a while, and hopefully if this fire doesn't burn Chris out, he'll be around for a while, but I do hear you on that issue. And it's really exciting to connect with your membership and folks involved in this. Having spent a lot of time in my career in Idaho and Montana and doing lots of skiing and snowshoeing, it's exciting to hear the passion for this backcountry skiing and backcountry skiing and snowshoeing and all the different winter activities, and the passion that you all have for that for our national forests. We appreciate that. I think Chris did a really good job of kind of providing a framework of some things that we are continuing to learn and what we could have done better. And, it was very telling from Hilary and David when I talked to you yesterday about how you've been in the thick of this process, and Darrell, it sounds like, for over 6 years. And thank you for that and for keeping your voice in the room. We learned a great deal from you, and we'll continue to do that. And I really, I hear you and agree with Chris and everyone that we could have done the collaborative process earlier. We definitely, as we move forward with other forest plans, we'll make changes for that. But our goal really was to hear all voices in the room and to work towards resolution on priority issues. And I thought, the workshop, that was a really good process to do that. And I thought there were really great conversations, but as you mentioned, it was a little too late in the process to come up with as many solutions as we might have as a group. But I really appreciate the effort and the conversation, and there were many hours of those workshops that people participated in, and that dedication means a lot. We still feel good coming out of the decisions and those workshops, around our decision-making around the Pacific Crest Trail and snow depth issues, and, trying to balance all these issues and expectations for multi-use on the forest during winter. So we really appreciate that. We obviously weren't able to get to consensus on everything. That's pretty difficult to do. But it's still, I think, a model for how our planning processes can work. And obviously continue to welcome your recommendations, and we'll make some tweaks in the future based on even the conversation today. So from the larger perspective, I'm really proud that these 5 national forests are leading the agency on OSV planning in California and beyond. As Hilary had mentioned, the Shoshone has been one other forest that's done this planning effort, but really the agency overall is watching closely, as are our partner groups, as we finalize these 5 OSV plans on these national forests. And it's going to be precedent changing. It's what we're doing is going to inform how other forests do their planning, and hopefully they will learn from us and be able to take some of our recommendations on what worked and what didn't, and we'll see some improved planning processes just from our efforts of being guinea pigs. Also, we are going to continue to have consistency across the forest, and one of the things that I'm struggling with as we finalize the regional look at these 5 different plans is we really do want consistency across the 5 forests and how we're dealing with especially national scenic trails and snow depth, but also other issues. And we're not completely there on all 5 forests, and there are different user groups and some differences among the 5 forests, but we are working toward that consistency as much as possible, and that's a priority for us. And that's also what we're talking to, at the Forest Service chief level and at the secretary level for USDA. They're watching this and communicating regularly with us about our planning efforts, and it's going to inform agency policy and department policy, and also just best practices and recommendations on how we move forward with the other forests. So, I think I'll close with that. Our hope and dream was to get all 5 of these plans done in time for winter recreation. As you all can guess, we're having a pretty rugged fire season. And, I don't think Chris and even our friends on the El Dorado and some of the other places and the Lassen can see straight right now and are just completely consumed with fire. But that was our hope and dream, and we're going to still work towards that as much as we can, but we may not be able to get there just because of the rough fire season right now. And then I just want to say, as we so maybe we don't get there this winter, I still have a secret hope and dream that we will, but when we do get there, we really welcome the continued partner involvement and in our implementation of the rules. And we want you to help us communicate. We want you to help us educate. I think Hilary, you talked about the importance of educating people. We want you very much to be part of that and to provide us feedback and ideas on how we can do it better, what we might be missing, and what the user groups really need from us to know where they can go and to have a good time out there. So we want your continued participation, and we really appreciate it. And we also want your continued monitoring. How is the plan working? What do we need to tweak? What are the things that aren't going well, and what can we do to make them better? So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the 6 years of work that you've done on this and the hours of time and your expertise. We really, really appreciate it. And we hope that the conversation will continue, that we'll continue to collaborate, and you will help us educate and implement when we get there.
Thanks, Jody. Yeah, we'll definitely be there. So Darrel, I'll go back to you because you have your hand raised. We only have about 10 more minutes for Q&A, and I definitely want to create some space for that. So want to bring on Melinda to feed us some questions from the Q&A. If anyone in the audience has questions that you have seen some come in through the chat, if you have further questions, and we may not get to all of them, we will not get to all of them, but we can certainly direct the questions to the panelists for follow-up later. Darrel, go ahead.
2 points I want to bring up, or else I would feel remiss. One is climate change. We're dealing with all these fires here, and we're seeing the effects, and people are seeing the smoke across the country from these fires. So with the workshops that were mentioned earlier, we had almost 30 hours of meetings. Climate change was only briefly mentioned by one presenter. I think it needs to be definitely a bigger part of the conversation. The other part is Plumas County is the home of skiing in the Americas. And, that's an important thing about this place that might be unique to others. And our ski history here runs deep and we're proud of it, and hope that people begin to become aware of this. And that's all I got. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Darrel. Melinda, what's come in as far as questions for our panelists?
Yeah, I just want to make sure everybody knows that all of our panels this conference season are recorded and will be on our website. So if you miss any or you want to go back and listen in on this conversation, you definitely can. Those will be up later this week. The first question came from Gail, specifically for Chris. Gail asked, do you plan to reevaluate the OSV areas after these devastating fires? I'm hoping Chris is still here. Yep, there we go.
So bear with me just a second and spot here. Yeah, so obviously we're going to have to take a look at the changed landscape out there. However, I think we want to draw a distinction between the planning level decisions that we're making and what's available, and the conditions that are going to change over time, whether it's due to fire, snowfall, etc. And that really, to me, is part of that back end piece. It's not about the decision. It's about how do we continue to work together as a collaborative group and set a structure for that so that we can have informed decisions. Going back to last year as an example, after the North Complex, we had some changed conditions on the landscape, and we had some designated OSV routes that were groomed within there. And we had to figure out how we balance closures with maintaining access. And we were very specific that we were only going to look at the areas within sideboards. We were not going to be getting into the areas of the OSV planning piece of it. And so we were able to work with some of the stakeholders to make areas available. But I think it's more about the planning piece is the planning piece. It's like the zoning. We're going to set the sideboards, the expectations in the areas, and then we set the mechanism to adjust as we go over time as a collaborative group with some clear expectations and criteria. So long answer to a very short question. We will continue to update and adjust.
Let me jump in, Melinda, because I want to, while we have Chris here, I want to get the answer to this because we keep saying collaboration and collaborative as if it's a silver bullet and it's this sort of golden, it's what's going to bring us together and make everything perfect. And I've seen a couple of people, Gail and others in the chat, mention, a lot of us have been working collaboratively on this for 6 years, and there are parties that are dug in and really don't want to collaborate and don't feel the need to. And so I wonder, there's no easy answer to this, but say we started at the beginning or on the left side planning part, pre-assessment, and really get a collaborative going. How do we avoid people just sort of retrenching year over year and saying, I don't feel the need to collaborate? Chris is gone. Jody, maybe you have an insight in that. Or maybe
well, that's a really excellent question, and I don't know if we'll ever get there. I mean, I'd like to think that we could, and someone, Gail in the chat talked about, it takes a well-trained facilitator to run those. I think that is correct, but I think we would have to sit around the table and build that trust and those expectations, and do that from the beginning, and have those hard conversations. And everywhere that I've seen collaboration work, and a lot of my experience has been more, with ranchers and really difficult issues on rangeland and public lands. It takes a lot of time and trust to bring everyone to the table and find some common ground, but you don't always get everyone there. But I think if we would have started earlier, brought those sideboards in and those expectations, and really tried for folks to build that trust and spend that time together, we probably would be farther along than we are now as far as people being dug in. But I think we all know that we won't always completely get there.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Jody. Back to you, Melinda.
Sure. We've got a question here from Jim. Is there any schedule or target date for all affected forests to start OSV planning?
Is there any, can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
No worries. Is there any schedule or target date for all affected forests to start OSV planning?
So right now we're just focused, for us, California's focusing on these 5 forests. And as I said, our goal was to try to get it all implemented by this winter, and it's likely we won't make that. I think agency-wide, I haven't seen an overall goal, and maybe Garrett, if he's on in the chat, could provide me some sideboards on that. But right now we don't really have a set schedule for the rest of the forests in California. I don't think the agency overall has a set schedule for forests across the country at this point. Although, I think at the chief's level and the agency level at the Washington office, it is a priority, and that's why they're watching this closely. And we've got a couple other forests like the Inyo that are starting the process right now, and we'll see that through.
Great.
And Garrett's helping me with that too.
Yep. And Garrett says the INYO and the LTBMU are both working to start OSV travel management. So I think Jim's question was more just generally about all of the forests that will definitely need this. Is there a start date? So yeah, that's awesome. A question from Justin: knowing all recreation has impacts, environmental and social, should the closed unless open strategy be applied to non-motorized recreation as well?
I can take that one. Let you off the hook, Jody.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, so the travel management rule is very specific to motorized use. And it does not address non-motorized use. And so we don't have a regulation to address non-motorized use, but one thing that Winter Wildlands Alliance does advocate for in travel planning and other processes is to think holistically about, whatever season. For us, it's usually winter, think holistically about winter recreation. And so we would really like to see winter travel planning as a more holistic effort where you're looking at non-motorized recreation as well, and understanding how non-motorized users are on the landscape. And there are certainly places that are not appropriate for any human activity. After I answer this question, I will throw something into the chat. Winter Wildlands Alliance recently published a science synthesis, kind of a literature review of all the best available science pertaining to backcountry winter recreation. So resource to help understand, not just motorized, but also non-motorized use and impacts to wildlife, natural resources, what have you. Forest planning, which again, I've alluded to, but we're not really talking about in this panel, is an opportunity to to institute some closures for other uses. I think the Bridger Teton National Forest is, this actually isn't really a forest planning example, but the Bridger Teton is one forest that has winter range closures where no people are allowed to go into certain areas of the forest in the wintertime, because those are places that are really important for wintering ungulates for elk, mule deer, bighorn sheep in some cases. And those animals, they don't really care if you're on a snowmobile or on skis, they're going to run if they see you. And so national forests certainly have the flexibility to do those sorts of closures, but the travel management rule itself doesn't explicitly address non-motorized uses.
Great, thank you, Hilary. We've got 2 more questions. We'll try to get to both of them. For the first is from Jesse. In the previous panel, which was our panel this morning on curbing enthusiasm and the outdoor recreation boom, Jesse says recreational carrying capacity was mentioned several times, but there was little discussion about how to regulate use / access at or below this carrying capacity. Does the Forest Service consider the impacts of oversnow vehicles versus human use on limiting the overutilization in this travel planning process? And I know that's a big question, so I'm happy to reread that or decipher it as best as I can from Jesse.
I can try to take that one a little bit, but and maybe there's smarter brains than me in this panel. I mean, we absolutely do need to look at that, and that is part of our planning process. But we're probably not at the granular level of completely evaluating that. I mean, we try to take a look at where use is high and figure out what kind of capacity and what's happening to the natural resources there and manage that. But it's really more on a case by case, location by location basis right now. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in a little bit I'm obviously not at the planner level here.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
but I appreciate Jesse throwing that in. It's something that we do need to keep visiting, and it's, you know, it is at the core of winter travel planning, or should be, and all kinds of planning. Go ahead, Hilary.
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, with winter carrying capacity, a lot of it ties back to parking. You know, we're pretty parking limited in the wintertime, no matter what you're doing. And so I think as we look at expanding parking lots or not expanding parking lots, that carrying capacity needs to be part of the equation. In our previous panel, one of the panelists, Corey Llewellyn, who's the district ranger in Bozeman, he mentioned, you know, this Bridger infrastructure project where there's a bunch of stakeholders coming together to discuss recreation infrastructure across an entire mountain range just outside of Bozeman. And I'm part of that group, part of that collaborative. And one of the things we're discussing is, you know, where is additional recreation appropriate or not? And really thinking about carrying capacity at a kind of a micro level on the landscape, like drainage by drainage, and understanding wildlife use and other resources as well.
Great, thanks. One more question.
All right, we have from Jed, what happens if a forest does not start OSV travel planning, winter travel planning? I don't think that's an
know if
option.
this is the right answer. Did I interrupt her?
No, go ahead.
I don't know if this is the right answer. I mean, at this time right now, I mean, we've got forests working toward it, and it is becoming more of a priority for us to do this, especially when it comes to scenic trails and the high use of our forests right now since COVID and beyond. But you know, right now, whether the forest makes it a priority or region makes it a priority is pretty much at the local level right now, and it might mean that the only way that we get there sometimes is through a lawsuit, which I hope that's not the case and not where we want to be. And, you know, our hope is that we're going to try to get through all our forests here in California. It's going to take a little while, but we've made it a priority, and I suspect other regions will make it a priority, and it's going to become more of a priority at the national level.
Okay, thanks for that, Jody. And I'm going to have to, as timekeeper, intercede here. We're at almost 3 minutes past the hour, and I want to respect everyone's time. Thank you so much to the panelists for joining us, for sharing your expertise and experience. And thank you to our audience for participating in this. And I want to encourage you to join the other panels. And if you can't join the other panels, please do download the recordings. In about an hour, we're going to start talking about improving capacity on the ground. We'll be talking about volunteer trail hosts and snow rangers. Should be another great, robust discussion. Onward and upward. Thank you again. And we'll see you all soon. And thanks, Chris, for calling in.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.